Welcome back to our episode. Ryan here with Chaos and Maine. Today we have on one of the best in the business, broadcaster at BT Sports, Caroline Pearce. Caroline, how are you doing?
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Great speaking with you. Love your work. I see you bringing out the
Thank you.
content every week, every weekend. And how has it been after UFC 282? Have you just been releasing content, all the interviews you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, it was a crazy night up until the final two fights. Every fight was a finish. So we would just go backstage, getting all the post-fight interviews. And I don't know if you've ever, or people watching have ever seen the sort of backstage setup that we have, because people think that we get this amazing view of the fight but we're watching on these tiny monitors with athletes and their team just kind of left, right, and center and loads of buzz and noise around us. So it's really exciting, but it's like a stimulus overload, that's for sure.
No, yeah, I always wonder what it was like backstage. It seems like it's always exciting at these events. And one of the big things going into this card was the 18-year-old Raul Rosas Jr. He went in there against a guy very older than him. Some people didn't know what to expect, but he went in there. He did his thing. He looked very good. So, what were your
Yeah.
overall thoughts on that performance from him?
Yeah, first of all, I think he lived up to the expectation. I think there was a lot of expectation on him going into the fight. And even Dana White said in the build-up, he said, when he gets the bright lights of a full arena and this is the UFC, you're fully in the UFC now, he thought that, maybe that could get to him, but it didn't. This kid was so calm and collected. And I spoke to him afterwards, immediately in the aftermath. He came back and did an interview with us for BT Sport. And I said, like, how are you so calm? And, how are you so collected? And he said, because I visualized this and I knew this would happen. He said, so for me, this is just what was I expected of myself. And then he went on to just talk about, the champion, talking about that he feels like he's the guy that could give him a good fight. So his goal of becoming the youngest ever UFC champion, I feel like in his mind is going to happen. He says by age 20. So he was fully focused and very impressive. He really was.
Yeah, I remember watching him walk out, and it's like he didn't look nervous at all. He seemed so calm, and it's his first time walking out in front of all these fans. He seemed calm, and you said it. He's already calling out the champ. Like 18 years old, he already thinks he can be the champ. Like to have that confidence, it's crazy, but it's insane to watch. It's amazing to watch. So,
Yeah.
what do you think his ceiling is right now at such a young age?
Do you know what I mean? Obviously, he's coming to the UFC. He's got a great, not just a win, but a finish. He did it in spectacular fashion. But the UFC, as we've seen with Paddy Pimblett, Sean O'Malley, they're not going to just suddenly give him a ranked opponent. So he's going to have, with Ian Gary as well, our other British fighter. They're going to give him fights that make sense for him, fights to enable him to continue to build that confidence, to shine. Do what he does before he starts getting put in against those ranked opponents. So you see it a lot with fighters that are those kind of standout stars, and they're on maybe their third or fourth fight in the UFC, and there's people saying, "Well, you haven't fought a ranked opponent yet." Well, nor would anyone else at either their age or that many fights into their UFC career, especially so young. So I think his natural progression will be a couple of other fighters that not necessarily known names, but make sense. And then there'll be that one fight that'll push him into that. Okay, you're heading towards the rankings now, and go from there. But he wants to be a champion soon. There's other fighters like Paddy, who he said, I've got several more years before I even got to worry about fighting for the title. Tom Aspinall had said the same as well. He said, I want to take my time. But I think this kid's got a record in mind that he wants to beat John Jones. So maybe we'll see it a little bit faster.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one guy to do it, it could be him because he's already so young. He's looks great already. He already wants to be active. He said he wants to fight this weekend, which is
I
kind of
know, yeah, this weekend he said, I don't think that's happening.
yeah. I mean,
But I love the enthusiasm.
yeah, I mean, you gotta love it. He wants to be active. He wants to get in there. Great fight. I'm excited to see what's next for him.
Yeah.
Another fight on the card: Bryce Mitchell versus Ilia. I mean, you didn't know. Some people didn't know what to expect. They didn't know if Bryce was gonna get him down, Ilia, but Ilia looked amazing, man. I mean, he stuffed the takedowns. His striking was unreal. He hurt him, and then he did the thing not many people expected. He submitted Bryce Mitchell. So, what were your overall thoughts on that performance?
Yeah, do you know, going into that one, I didn't have a strong like who I thought was going to win that one. I thought it would be, obviously they're both undefeated. I thought it would be a really close fight, but I just think Ilya sort of had a more well-rounded skill set that he showcased in there. I mean, that big shot that sort of stunned him before he locked in the submission, I thought was really impressive. And I just think he's ready for that sort of even higher ranked opponent now. I know there's all this talk of him and Paddy, and maybe that will happen down the line, but he's on the verge of higher ranked opponents. So I was really impressed with him. He speaks decent English, but our sort of Spanish counterpart backstage, Carlos, he was telling me, he's like, if you could understand what he says in Spanish, he's very eloquent, very well spoken, and really articulates what he wants to say very well. And I don't think we're necessarily getting that when we just hear him get angry at Paddy and all the other sort of backstage stuff. But one thing he said to me, because I was saying, well, do you want to fight maybe UFC London? There's Arnold Allen. I know he called out Brian Ortega, but we've got Arnold Allen there. Would that be a good fight in London? And he said, I don't want to fight with people booing me anymore. I want to feel some love from the crowd. He got the boos there in Vegas because he's fighting an American. In London, it was pretty bad because he was fighting Paddy. So I think he just wants to feel like a little bit of love from the crowd and his supporters. But he was very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, he deserves that respect with his role in the UFC right now, going to the top. Like every time he's fighting, it's crazy what he's doing. And you mentioned Paddy Pimblett. Like Dana White said after the fights, he said, I kind of want Ilia against someone above him, like instead of fighting someone below him. So you feel the same way, like Paddy, Ilia, pause that for a second and let Ilia fight someone a little above him.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, that's more of there's beef there. Yeah. Let's let them fight at some point, but I don't think that's the natural next fight for Ilia. I mean, he's also fights in a different weight class primarily, So Paddy's a fully fledged lightweight. He's at featherweight. He went up to lightweight because he said nobody else would fight him at featherweight. But I think he's on a good trajectory now in the featherweight division. And Bryce Mitchell, he said earlier in the week, he said, when people are asking, well, one of you are gonna lose your O, someone's O has to go, and he was like, I've lost before, I've lost in training, there's people that have beaten me up in training, so I don't think he was so attached to that, and he's just always respectful, and he's a tough guy anyway. So interesting to see who he fights next, but I think Ilia Topuria is definitely a name that we'll be watching now as he sort of heads into that top 10.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a guy that could be in the title contention very soon. I mean, he's already going up there. That was a great performance by him. Very exciting for his next fights and everything else. Co-main event of the evening, Paddy Pimblett, Jared Gordon. I mean, a lot of people didn't like the decision. I mean, I'm not going to lie. Once that fight ended, I thought Jared won 29-28, but I wasn't too upset with it because I felt like, maybe Jared didn't do enough in the third round to secure that victory. But what were your overall thoughts on that performance? Like, what did you think about it?
Yeah, so when they were reading the scorecards, initially I thought going to Jared. I thought Paddy had lost it. People are throwing around the word robbery. I don't agree with it being a robbery. I think that's a little bit harsh. I agree. I feel like Jared could have done more in the third round. And Dana sort of alluded to that in the press conference as well. He said, you can't assume you've won those first two rounds and then cruise. And he didn't land any significant damage in that third round. Jared, that is. So I'm not upset with that result. In fact, I'm happy with the result because Paddy's English, and from an English broadcast perspective, and someone that knows Paddy, I like Paddy. Then no, I'm not upset with the result in that respect. But I could see how majority of people are seeing it. It should have gone Jared's way. I could also see, depending on what you're scoring and what you're looking at, that it could possibly have been a Paddy win. But it's a difficult one for me because I don't judge fights. I don't like to give too much opinion on who I think did or didn't win, because I'll now be face to face with those fighters as well next time I talk to them, and they do have a way of saying and hearing things and saying, so you thought I lost. So I'm always a little bit careful with that. But no, I must admit I did think it was Jared's fight, but when they said it was Paddy's, and I haven't watched it back yet, I probably will. I like to do that after a fight. I'll see how I can kind of score it then. But yeah, I do think Jared probably could have pushed a little bit harder in that third round if he was to secure that.
Yeah, and I feel like the robbery term's thrown around too much. Like, if it's a robbery, it's like kind of like a fight, not close at all. Like, that was a very close fight watching it back. So
I agree. I tweeted out something, close fight went in the direction of Jared, and loads of people say, close fight, what are you watching? And I was like, well, what are you watching? Like, it was a close fight. It definitely was a close fight, but Paddy's never that happy with his performances. He hasn't been, each of his fights in the UFC, we've spoke afterwards, and he's, oh, I wish I'd done that, or maybe I should have done this. So he's still learning, he's still learning. It's still, he's had a lot of fights, obviously, prior, Cage Warriors and so forth. But I feel within the UFC promotion, it's almost like you don't start again. That's not what I mean. But you're up against much tougher competition. So you're going to continue to learn. And I think afterwards, he as much as he's very confident, he'll still be critical of himself and his performance and tell you what he wanted to do more of. So Yeah.
I mean, it was certainly an interesting situation. And one of the things brought up, like, what do you feel like we could do for judging so we don't have this problem? I mean, someone said, I think it was on Ariel Helwani's show, the one of the judges, he did a fight Friday in Bellator, and it was for the main event,
Yeah.
Sabatello. It was like a weird
Yeah.
scorecard. He was the same one for that. So, like, what do you think we could do, like, to fix this so that there isn't a problem? Make like open scoring. Are you a fan of that? Like, what are your personal thoughts on judging all that?
I mean, yeah, I read what Ariel said about he was literally flown across the country to,
Yeah.
probably tired to judge a fight the next night. Thank goodness the judges weren't needed until the last two fights of the night. Dana White's often said, or often says, don't leave it in the hands of the judges. So when someone asked him, well, what do we do about these judges? The same question you're asking me. He said, well, I haven't had to answer that question in a while. So clearly things are getting a little bit better. But yeah, they don't necessarily, people start blaming the UFC. You're allowing this to happen, but the UFC don't decide the judges. I'm not sure sort of everybody knows that, the Nevada State Athletic Commission or wherever the fight is, they allocate their judges. But open scoring is an interesting one. I can see fighters feel different ways about it as well. Some fighters are in favor of it, others are not. Why don't we trial it? Why don't they trial open scoring and see if it does make a difference? It might help the fact that some fighters might think they're up and they're not. Hopefully their corners are being honest with them. We hear many do. I like the corners that say you are down, you need to finish that fight, as we saw with Alex Pereira, as we saw this weekend as well. So if you're going to do that, I think maybe there's a trial period where they do that and see if it makes a difference. But I guess don't leave it in the hands of the judges for one, and just needs to continue to be better education.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe try it on like a contender series fight or something, like a fight night, something, just see how it goes or whatever.
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
said,
But
no, go on.
No, I was going to say, but it's not something I've personally looked into, in a huge amount of depth or looked at what the kind of options are. But I hear and I listen to what people's opinions are on it.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting situation. I loved your point about the corner saying like you're down, like we saw Leon Edwards against Usman go out there and do
Brilliant.
that.
Yeah, brilliant cornering. And that's what we should see. I mean, some corners want to make the fighters feel good and you're doing all the right things, keep going. And we're like, you're not, that's not working. So I feel that honesty and a corner knowing their fighter and what's going to get them, back to what the focus should or would be, or what the change of direction needs to be, are the ones that make a difference, and we've seen that time and time again.
Yeah. I mean, you can't get too comfortable. You always got to be going out there and going.
Exactly.
And last thing on Paddy Pimblett, what do you feel is next for him? You feel he gets someone a little above him now? You feel UFC kind of gives him another tough opponent, like a guy like similar to Jared Gordon? Like it's kind of a tough situation. Like you don't know what Dana White, Hunter Campbell they're looking at. So what do you feel like could be next for Paddy?
Look, I think well, first of all, opponent aside, I think give him a fight night to headline. I know he wants to be on the pay-per-views now, but Dana said it when Paddy interviewed Dana on his own podcast. He said, the next step for you would be a fight night, to headline a fight night. And that gets, even more eyes on you. He'll sell, not sell, it's not a pay-per-view, but, he'll get a lot of eyes on the event. I think another Jared Gordon style opponent. That was his toughest test. He said all week in the lead up, he said, no, my previous opponents would finish Jared. He's not my toughest opponent. In his interview to me afterwards, he said, well, of course I'm going to say that. I'm not going to say that he is my toughest opponent, but he said he was my toughest opponent. That's the toughest test I've had to date. He had a lot of respect for Jared as well. So I think someone similar to Jared, I think would be a good next step. I did read something, I'm kind of going against what I said earlier about, a lot of these fighters like Paddy, and we talk about Raul, you're not necessarily putting them up against ranked opponents straight away. So when people compare Paddy to Conor McGregor, I can't remember who was talking about it earlier this week, and they were saying, if you look at Conor McGregor's fourth fight in the UFC, though, he fought Dustin Poirier. Yeah. Dustin Poirier was ranked and he knocked him out. So there is a case to say, if you're that good and you're that big a star, start fighting the ranked opponents and proving what you can do in that respect. But it's different for everybody. And everyone's journey is at a different rate. We see the likes of Charles Oliveira getting his belt after a real mixed record. So, it doesn't mean that the end goal won't be that they'll be UFC champion. The path is different, but it looks different for different people and what they're ready for. But in terms of Paddy, I'd like to see him at UFC London when we go back in March for the pay-per-view. Hopefully Leon Edwards, well, obviously providing there's no injuries, Leon and Usman will have their trilogy. But I think put Paddy on that card. Give him I think a few people maybe turned against Paddy a little bit this week. I think it would be good to sort of give him his fans and his environment back again to get another tough opponent, but one that he has an equal chance of winning, and go from there. So he's a confident guy, but I wonder how much some of what was said about him this week, questioning the result, some of the other stuff, during the fight week itself might sort of play into his mind a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, part of me feels like Paddy's gonna go out there in his next fight and like do his thing because he sees getting a lot of hate now. He sees not many people think he won that fight. I think maybe next fight he's just gonna go out there and put on a spectacular performance. I could be totally wrong, but I have that feeling.
I agree, and because knowing Paddy, he'll want to do that. He won't be happy that people were questioning his result, but his star power is still just growing and growing regardless. And in fact, it became even more of a talking point, that people were even questioning the result. I was at the airport leaving Vegas back to Los Angeles, and two guys sat next to me in the lounge. They were saying, "Oh, do you see that Paddy guy fought again?" And they were chatting, "Oh, I think he's from somewhere like Manchester," or they were, I didn't want to correct them, but they didn't sound like they were big UFC fans, but they knew Paddy. So he's already got that star power, and I think regardless of who he fights next, it's going to continue to grow.
Yeah. He's already one of the biggest stars in UFC. Only a couple fights in. He's only going to go up from here. And last couple things going here. Thanks again. Main event. Another interesting fight. Ankalaev versus Jan. We see the first couple rounds, Jan's chopping up his leg. At a point, you're like, this fight's probably over. I mean, he's having trouble walking. He was still trying to stand with him. But then Ankalaev does what he does best. He goes for the wrestling, beats him up the last 2 rounds doing that. So overall, what were your overall thoughts on that performance? Like, did you agree with the decision?
Well, I'm going to be honest here. I only saw half that fight. Okay. So again, like I was describing backstage, I'm in the middle of an interview with Paddy while that fight's going on. That's just the way it is. If they bring Paddy to us and he's ready to be interviewed, you're not going to ask him to stand there and wait. He couldn't even stand up. He had to sit down to do the interview because he'd hurt his foot. So I sort of watched the first round and then I watched the last round, and I got sort of filled in on the middle there. But my understanding was that going into the fifth, most people were scoring it like whoever wins this fifth round wins the whole thing. And as you said, Magomed decided to go to what he knows best. I think his leg was pretty chopped up as well, like you said, and sort of grind out what I think most of us agree would be the victory. Jan immediately was acting like he knew he didn't win. He was like, I don't know that I lost, I don't know that I won, but he was saying, give the belt to Ankalaev. When I spoke to Jan backstage, I asked him that. I said, you don't feel you won that? And he said, I was just thinking of the last round and maybe the last 2 rounds. He said, I mean, because that was what I was so angry with and frustrated with. He said, so I felt like I'd lost. He said, but everyone's been saying to me, actually, no, it could well be the draw that it was, agreed upon by the judges to be based on his action in those earlier rounds. So I think even the time from leaving the octagon to getting backstage to us, he was starting to go, actually, maybe I did a little bit better than I thought I did. I felt disappointed for Ankalaev. I think personally, I think he did win that fight. And then to hear literally while we're doing media that Dana White's already made a fight on the fight night, which he never normally does. So sort of a double whammy there. And he's already, I mean, I think Glover deserves that title shot. That was meant to be his fight anyway. So I'm happy it's Glover. I was just surprised they went with someone completely different and didn't say, okay, most people thought that Magomed won that, give Magomed to Glover. But I think the reason they didn't do that is Dana doesn't want that title to remain vacant for what's probably going to need to be another 3 months or so for Ankalaev to heal up. I mean, he looked pretty battered up. So did Jan. So I actually said to Magomed during the interview, I said, well, think about it this way. Yuri's going to be out for probably a year. By the time Glover fights in January in Brazil, time frame of him then defending it if he wins, or whoever wins defending it, probably works with you sort of coming back into feeling like you're fit and healthy again. And he was disappointed. He kind of shook it off a little bit, but it could well work in that way.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Dana doesn't usually make fights after the fights immediately, and he did it right after. And some of the guys won, some of the guys lost. Like Anthony Smith, he found out live on the broadcast.
I actually saw Anthony Smith in the bar afterwards. So there's a bar at the Park MGM Hotel where the ESPN team, the BT Sport team, we all kind of just congregate. It's like probably 1 in the morning by the time we've all finished our duties, and we're just chew the fat on the whole night. It's always a nice little catch up with everyone. And Anthony was there, and I just said, how you feeling? And he was just I mean, everyone was praising him on how he kept it together because he was literally on the live broadcast when he found out. But yeah, he was pissed. Basically, he was not happy with that. And in fact, what he said is that they did call him afterwards. They did, sorry, this is what we've done. Did you know? And he was like, yeah, I heard. This is UFC. Called him Hunter Campbell. He said, yeah, I heard on the broadcast. And they said, we didn't know if you'd be ready for January, so we gave it to Jamahal. So that was tough one to take, I'm sure.
Yeah, tough. I mean, unfortunate situation for Anthony Smith, but I'm sure he'll get another fight.
Yeah,
it's a tough one though. To lose out on that, though.
I know, and I'm happy to Glover. So I actually did an interview with Glover before Dana White made that announcement. So I'm talking to Glover, and I'm like, "Where does this leave you?" And he had no idea at that point. He was like, "It's a mess. It's a mess." He's like, "No one wants to see that fight again between Magomed and Yan." Can probably agree with that, but at that point, talking to him, he had no idea. And then just a few minutes afterwards, he found out at the same time everyone else did. So happy for him. He is literally one of the nicest, coolest guys in the whole UFC. Like he's definitely that guy that he's been there a long time. He knows how this works. He doesn't get too stressed and upset about anything, and just a really nice person to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best in the sports, Glover. It's always fun watching his fights. And speaking of Glover versus Jamal Hill, Brazil. Glover gets maybe who knows final fight, but gets it in Brazil. Going to be great to see. So, what are your thoughts on that fight? Is that a fight you agree with, Hill versus Glover? I mean, I feel like that's kind of one of the only fights you can make at this point.
Yeah, I think it's another. There was several ways they could have spun that, but yeah, it makes sense. It definitely makes sense. I think it's amazing that Glover. Things happen for a reason. Sometimes it's amazing that Glover gets to fight in Brazil. They haven't been in Brazil since just before everything shut down for the pandemic, and I'd like to see him win it and get that belt back, even if he then walks off into the sunset and vacates it or whatever he decides to do. But I think that would be a nice story. So he didn't get to defend it. He defended it, but he didn't get to win that first title defense fight of the year. I mean, it was incredible. He could have won that mistake at the end. So I'd like to see, even if he doesn't, I think he's going to be one of those Hall of Famers. But I'd love to see him get that fight back, get that title back, and sail off into the sunset.
Yeah, I mean, what would be a better ending for Glover Teixeira's career? I mean, you couldn't end it much better. But for you, appreciate the time. I really do. Thanks again for catching up. It's great speaking with you. And if you want to shout out any social media or anything, the floor is yours.
Yeah, of course. You can follow me at Caroline Pearce on Instagram and Twitter. My Twitter's all sort of fight updates and inside information throughout the night. And my Instagram's a mixture of MMA, boxing, and a lot of the fitness work that I do. I have a fitness app called Fit On App that I'm a part of. So you get a lot of workouts on there as well.
Oh, okay. That's really cool. Well, yeah, that's cool. But thanks again for your time. I really do appreciate it. It's great speaking to you about the UFC and stuff. And have a great day.
You too, Ryan. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.